deacons as we're going through this study of important words in the New Covenant. And Brother Lentz raised a question at the end of class regarding the women who are mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 5. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, you know what? That's a wonderful segue into a word study in itself. Because that particular passage contains a word that is very important in the Christian economy of things that will both help us to answer the question that he asked, but also will help us to see some important doctrine in the Christian covenant. So the word that we're focusing on tonight is the word honor. Honor. And I want to take just a very brief trip, if you will, through the New Testament, and we're going to arrive at 1 Timothy chapter 5, and then we're going to talk about the meaning of that word and its application, and I think in the process we're going to answer the question that you were asking. So the word honor typically in English carries the idea of respect, esteem, giving deference to someone, especially by virtue either of some position that they hold or by virtue of some particular quality of excellence that they exhibit, right? The word that we're looking at for our text tonight it's the Greek word timao in the verb form, time in the noun form. It applies in different scriptures as verb or noun, but it has a little bit more restricted meaning than our word honor. It does apply sometimes to mean to give respect to someone, but its base root meaning has to do with value. And in particular, value in the sense of assigning a monetary value to something. And so oftentimes the word is used to talk of paying a price or estimating a value of something in the sense of how much is it worth? How precious is something? Again, like in the context of precious stones or precious metals. And so it has a lot more to do with the concept of value and worth than our English word honor necessarily always carries. Okay? So sometimes the word is applied sort of metaphorically to mean to give respect to hold in high esteem. But again, always in the background is this idea of something being worth much, of being valuable. Okay? So when we think about that, now let's take a little journey through the New Testament. And I've put the verses up here where the word is found. This column here is the verb form, and these other columns over here are the noun form. Matthew 15 will be our first passage, and I've gone ahead and given you an arrow to the parallel in Mark, which is Mark chapter 7. But in Matthew chapter 15, begin reading with me in verse 1. Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." And he answered and said to them, "Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, 'Whoever says to his father or mother, whatever I have that would help you has been given to God,' he is not to honor his father or his mother, and by this you invalidated the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men.'" All right, 3 times in this text the word honor comes up, and every time it's a version, of this Greek word. The first one is his quotation from the law of Moses in verse 4, where Jesus says that the law requires you to honor father and mother. Now, I don't know about you, but for years and years and years growing up, I was taught, from Ephesians chapter 6, for example, that as a child it was my obligation to honor father and mother, and I took that to mean to give proper respect to my parents. In other words, say yes sir and yes ma'am, and do as I'm told, please and thank you. Treat them, in a way that conveys respect and humility. Well, that's part of it. But that's actually not even the heart of the matter that Jesus is talking about here. And we know that because of what the rest of the context gives us. Jesus quotes that passage not to say that you're leaving out your sirs and ma'ams when you talk to your parents, or to say that you're not speaking respectfully toward your parents, or you're not doing as you're told by your parents. No, he goes on and says, you are violating this commandment of God, and here's how you're doing it. You're saying to your parents, that which I have that would help you has been given to God. Now, let's take a step back just a moment. Because remember that the New Testament was written in the 1st century, not the 21st. And so it's helpful for us, if we can, to take off our 21st century glasses and try to put on our 1st century glasses so that we see things against the cultural backdrop in the way that they would have. Ordinarily speaking, in the Jewish household, the father would have some sort of a trade. Maybe he was a carpenter. Maybe he was a shoemaker. Maybe he was a farmer, whatever he might be. That was the family business, and that was how he would provide for the family during the years between, when he was a young man and the time that he got to a point in life where he wasn't able to provide the main living for the family. When a young boy turned about 13 years of age, he was no longer primarily in the charge of his mother. He would be given primarily to the charge of his father. And beginning about the age of 13, the father would begin to apprentice that young man up in the family business, whatever it was. He'd teach him carpentry if he was a carpenter. He'd teach him shoemaking if he was a cobbler. He'd teach him farming if he was a farmer, whatever. And the idea was that there would come a time when that young man would come of age and he would take over the family business. And when he did that, probably around the same time, the father would more or less retire. Now, something you need to know about Jewish homes. Ordinarily speaking, Jews didn't have what we would call a single family dwelling. Not in the sense that we think about it. When we think about a single family dwelling, we're thinking about mom and daddy and the 2.5 kids that they have, right? When they thought about a single family dwelling, they thought about the patriarch of the family, his wife, any unmarried children that they had, any married sons that they had and their wives and their children, usually all lived in the same house. Okay? So the eldest son then succeeded to the role of patriarch when he stepped in and took over the family business. And now mom and daddy are there living in the house, but guess who's going to be providing their living? The son is, by virtue of the work that he's going to do. And he's going to provide not only for his mom and daddy, but he's also going to provide for everyone else who lives in the house. And as a matter of fact, that living arrangement was referred to by a term, father's house. My father's house. So when you get, for example, to John chapter 14, and Jesus says, in my father's house are many rooms, he's using a term that was very familiar in Jewish culture. Now, there's a lot packed into what Jesus is saying there that I don't have time to unpack tonight. But I say all of that to say this. Here is a tradition that these Jewish people have come up with and said, look, you don't necessarily have to provide a living for mom and dad. You can make a gift to the temple and exempt yourself from providing for mom and dad, and now they're on their own to provide their needs in their old age. Jesus said when you do that, you violate the law of Moses. But now think about this just a moment. By virtue of that very discussion having any meaning at all, we have to understand the word honor there to carry the idea of providing value to. Whether it's in the form of actual food and drink, or it's in the form of the money that would be used to buy that food and drink and clothing and all of those sorts of things. The idea here is that the son is providing a living for the parents. Okay? And so the word honor here carries much more than saying your sirs and ma'ams and using a respectful tone of voice. It carries the idea of taking on the responsibility of providing for your parents in their old age. Now, he uses the word one more time. This is in verse 8. Speaking of these hypocrites, he says, Isaiah rightly prophesied of you, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Reread that and replace the word honor with the word value. This people values me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. That adds just a little bit different facet of meaning to it, doesn't it? Because you can almost picture someone singing a song like, "Worthy art thou," and then going out and living like he's worthless, right? And that's essentially what Jesus is saying. Your mouth says God is worthy, but your life says God's instructions are worthless. Okay? So here's this idea then of honor, and it's specifically used in these passages to carry the idea of providing a living. Now, let's look over to Matthew chapter 19. In Matthew chapter 19, we have the story of the rich young ruler. It's also repeated in Mark chapter 10 and Luke chapter 18. I've given you those parallels as well. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he calls him good master, and he said, "What should I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one good, who is God. But if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." And he said, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness." Verse 19, honor your father and mother. Same commandment, right, that he was talking about back in chapter 15. Only in chapter 15, he has shown us something about what that means beyond just the bare idea of giving respect to father and mother, right? Okay. Now, this is an interesting one. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 27. Here is where Judas has betrayed Jesus. And does anybody remember what the price of Judas's betrayal was? 30 pieces of silver. Judas takes that 30 pieces of silver and he begins to feel remorseful about having done what he did. And so he takes it back to the ones who had given it to him, the chief priests and scribes, and he throws it down when they won't take it back. Look at what verse 6 says. The chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, "It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood." The word price is our word honor here. Same exact word in the Greek. So when I tell you that the word carries the idea of a valuation, it's used that way on more than one occasion. Okay? I'm not going to read all of these to you. There are a couple that we could look at, perhaps that might shed a little bit of light. Let's look at John chapter 5 just one moment. Let's back up to verse 19. Jesus has essentially equated himself with the Father in verse 17, and the people are seeking to kill him as a result of that. Excuse me. In verse 19, he begins to say, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing. And the Father will show him greater works than these, so that you will marvel. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son also gives life to whom he wishes. For not even the Father judges anyone, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all will honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." Now, understand the background of what's going on here. They are angry with Jesus because he put himself on equality with God. And they're essentially saying, you're not worthy to be on equality with God. The funny thing is, that's almost exactly what Paul says, isn't it? In Philippians chapter 2. He was on equality with God, and he thought the equality with God a thing not to be held on to. They're angry with Jesus because they think there's a difference in worth here. And Jesus is saying, no, the Father is going to make it so that those who do not value the Son are also not valuing the Father. So you get the idea then that the idea carries with it value and a price. Now we come down to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And this word is used a couple of different ways in 1 Timothy chapter 5. I'm reading the New American Standard Version. Verse 1 says, do not sharply rebuke an older man. Incidentally, the word there is the very same word that's translated elder in other places in the Greek. That's the natural meaning, is someone who is older. Whether this text is simply talking about older men in general or elders in the office of elders specifically can be debated. I think several of our translations say don't rebuke an elder. But at any rate, I know this, in chapter 3, Paul is talking about the office of elders. Later on in this chapter, he's going to talk about the office of elders using this same word. And it seems odd to me to assume that in between those two times, he's going to use the same word to talk about something else. But that's just my 2 cents worth. You chew on that and see what you come up with. At any rate, he says, do not sharply rebuke an elder or an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. Now, verse 3. Honor widows who are widows indeed. Honor widows who are widows indeed. Now, he's about to launch into a discussion of who actually qualifies as widows indeed. And in the course of that conversation, he's also going to shed some light on what he means when he says to honor them. So let's keep reading. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now, here's what he's saying here. Make a return to their parents and practice piety in regard to their own family. What did Jesus say honoring father and mother meant in Matthew 15? Provide their living when the time comes, right? I would argue that that's exactly what Paul is saying here. A woman is a widow, however, she has living children or grandchildren. The obligation now falls on them to practice piety, to honor this mother, grandmother, who is with them and provide her living. Verse 5, now she who is a widow indeed, who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. Do you remember the widow of Nain, whose son Jesus healed? Do you remember he comes to the city of Nain, and they're in the middle of a funeral procession, and there's this widow who is crying, and she's crying, yes, because she's lost her son. But I would argue that her tears were made all the more bitter because, number one, she's a widow, and number two, he is her only son. Yes, she is bereft of all of her family, but in the society in which she lived, she was also left desolate, financially speaking. She had no father's house to belong to. Her husband's dead, her son's dead. There's no record of any other male relative that can take her in and take care of her. Now she's in exactly the same position that Naomi and Ruth found themselves in the book of Ruth. Remember that? They come back to Palestine after the husband of Naomi has died, which was tragedy in itself, but she had 2 sons that survived. And as long as they survived, they could provide a living for their mother, but then they both died. And so she and her daughters-in-law have a discussion at the beginning of the book where she's telling her daughters-in-law, look, go back to your father's houses. You're young, you can marry again, raise a family, and be looked after. But Ruth won't leave her. And so they go back to Palestine together, and the only way they can live is for Ruth to go out and hope that the folks that live in that area are following the law of Moses and not reaping the corners and borders of their field and not picking up any sheaves of their harvest that they happen to leave behind, so that she can go along and glean behind them and come up with something for she and her mother to live on, her mother-in-law to live on. And so that's what she's doing when she meets this man by the name of Boaz. And as circumstances turn out, Boaz is actually a relative of Naomi's husband. And under the law of Moses, he has the standing to go in and redeem Ruth as a kinswoman and marry her under the Levirate law. And that's what he does. But they were desolate without a relative like Boaz to come in and do the part of the near kinsman. So was this woman of Nain. She was desolate. She had no one to provide for her. Widows, indeed, I would argue in 1 Timothy 5, are practically in the same situation. They're desolate. They have no family to care for them. Okay, so what of them? Verse 6, she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. What's he talking about here? He's saying as long as a widow has family to provide for them, the obligation is on them to provide for her. Okay? But, verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list, New American Standard says. I believe the King James says enrolled. Do you have other translations besides those?
English Standard says enrolled.
Enrolled, English Standard? Okay. What list? What's he talking about here? Clearly, Timothy knew what list he's talking about. Let me suggest to you that the background for this is given to us in Acts chapter 6. Do you remember in Acts chapter 6, in very early days of the church, there was a dispute that arose because in the daily ministration, the Grecian widows were being overlooked while the Hebrew widows were being fed. And the apostles said, look, we can't leave the business of preaching the gospel to see to waiting tables. And so they appointed these 7 men to take care of that business. Clearly the church in Jerusalem had a daily ministration where they were providing waiting tables, providing food, providing evidently a living to the widows. Now, how did they know how many to prepare for? Kind of reading between the lines there, somebody had to make a list. How many do we prepare for? Well, who goes on this list? That's the discussion in 1 Timothy 5. Those who have a family should be provided for by their family. But put on the list if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. These are the kinds of folks, Paul says, that the church ought to be providing for. And they ought to be on that sort of list for the daily ministration. But, he says, refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard to Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened. Now here again, evidence that he's talking about the church providing for these widows. Okay? The church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So to answer the question that you were asking, Brother Lentz, I know it took me 40 minutes to get there. Who are these people that are listed and qualified here? These are the ones who are to be enrolled on the list of those whom the church is going to provide a living for, as opposed to those whose families have an obligation to care for them. Okay? Now, right after that discussion in verse 17, look at what Paul says, because he's still using this word. The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching, for the Scripture says, "You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages." What in the world is he talking about, muzzling oxen and threshing? Well, we don't really thresh with oxen anymore. All right. When they would harvest their grain, they would do so on a threshing floor, which was usually a big flat open area of either very hard packed earth or preferably stone. And they would beat the heads of grain so as to separate the little wheat berries from the husks that hold them. Then they would take something like a pitchfork, they called it a winnowing fan, and they would toss the whole bit up into the air so that the sea breezes blowing in off the Mediterranean Sea would blow through it and blow the husks away. That's the chaff that you read about, for example, in Psalm 1. The wheat, which was heavier, would fall back down to the floor. Sometimes they did that's called threshing. Sometimes they did this with a handheld thing like it was called a flail that they would use to beat them. Frequently, however, they would take a sled, and oftentimes it would have bits of rock and other things on the bottom of it, and they would weight that sled down, and they would hook it up to an ox. They didn't use horses back then because the horse collar hadn't been invented. I'm dead serious about that. You can't put a yoke on a horse; it'll choke it to death. But you can put a yoke on an ox, and you would have him pull this sled around in a circle on the threshing floor, and the friction of that heavy sled rolling over those little heads of grain would break loose the wheat berries or the barley grain from the chaff so that you could separate the two. Now, while this ox is walking around, the Bible literally said, don't muzzle him, because what's he going to do? Now and again, he's going to reach down and take a mouthful of that grain. Well, the principle is he's earned it. He's out there working. He's doing your threshing for you. Don't muzzle him. Now, we're not so familiar with that particular circumstance, but Paul makes it even clearer in the very next phrase. The laborer is worthy of his what? Wages. Wait a minute, are we talking about paying elders here? I assert to you that is precisely what we're talking about. I think we are precisely talking about the church providing a living for these men who have dedicated their lives to ruling well, and especially those who are preaching and teaching. They are to be counted worthy not only of honor, as the widows are, a living, but double honor. And he specifically goes ahead and identifies that with the idea of wages. And so what I'm suggesting to you then is that when we see the word honor, particularly when it derives from these two Greek words, timao or time, verb or noun, that we're talking about something that has, at least in the background of the discussion, the concept of value, worth, preciousness, and not merely the concept of giving respect to. Okay? Does that help at all? Does that answer your question, Brother Lentz?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good deal. It ties in, honestly, with the study last week on deacons, not only because there are some who have asserted that the women who are to be enrolled here were deaconesses. Well, you really can't find that in the text at all. What the text is talking about is the church providing for widows who are destitute, as opposed to those with families. But it's an excellent question. Okay? All right. I'm going to do something I don't think I've ever done in the history of this class and let you go early. Thank you so much for your attention.